Benjamin Franklin loved Saadi. And in fact, in the first issue of the newspaper that he published in Philadelphia, he tried to pass a story of Saadi as a lost parable from the Bible. It was playing joke with his audience. For me, Firoozeh, that's in the context of American transcendentalism.
Yes.
It's not just,
yes, absolutely.
It's not just Benjamin Franklin. Emerson adored Saadi. He thought he was reincarnation of Saadi. Thoreau loved Saadi and Hafiz.
None of whom could read Persian, by the way. They were all reading it through German translations.
Exactly, which then takes you back that American transcendentalism fascination with Persian is actually through German Romanticism.
Exactly.
European Romanticism's interest in Persian literature, poets, which is not just Persians, Arabs and Indians and others, but particularly Saadi and Hafiz and Nizami, etc., become staple of German and by extension European Romanticism.
But Iranian experience of colonialism in many ways is actually both a more positive one and a different one, in the sense that Iranians did manage to continue to write in their language. I'm always, and I'm sure you've encountered this too, when you read, for example, the works of Algerians of the first generation of the 1950s and 60s in particular, some of their most famous writers. And I love this metaphor of writing in your stepmother tongue, that many of them didn't know anymore how to write in Arabic, and so they were forced to write in the language of the colonizer. And I love that image of, you use the maternal imagery, and so the sort of the stepmother tongue is. And I think Persian, Iranian history and culture, we sort of escaped that in a way. We escaped that.
And the metaphor, the way that I visualize it is the Persian poet comes out of the court, wants to run to the next court, but the next court is speaking French or English, and the Persian poet doesn't speak it, and finds himself and eventually herself in a space that eventually becomes a public space. And they, as you know, in my argument, they call that public space vatan, homeland. The way I see it, cultural production is promiscuous, doesn't remain loyal to just one mode of production. And if you look at the history of Iran, cultural production over the last, say, 150 years, at the height, in the period leading to the constitutional revolution, is mostly prose. The constitutional period, say 1900 to 1930s, is by and large poetry. That is, paramount mode of cultural production is poetry. And it is in the 1930s that poetry goes through the Nimaic revolution, from 1930s to 1960s, and then with the writings of Jamalzadeh and Sadiq Hidayat and etc., fiction comes to fore. So 30s and 60s, poetry after the Nimaic revolution goes forward into 60s, and fiction from, say, Hidayat all the way to Golshiri goes into its thing. 1960s, with the, say, the works of Farokh Ghaffari, Ibrahim Golestan, in the late 50s and early 60s, suddenly cinema becomes the modus operandi of cultural production. And it is also sort of a strange and loving historical fact that the father and mother of Iranian cinema were Ibrahim Golestan and Firoozeh Kashani-Sabet, who were also lovers. But Golestan comes from prose, magnificent prose of Golestan, particularly in his short stories, which are gem, as Rozegar Rafte, Hekayat, etc. From fiction, he goes to cinema, and Firoozeh Kashani-Sabet from poetry goes to cinema. In the case of Firoozeh Kashani-Sabet, there is a sharp difference between her first three books, Asir, Divar, and Osyan, and her fourth collection, Tavallud Digar. But what is in between is, of course, Khane Siyah Hast, is the house is black, which is.
She is very doleful.
Well, the thing is that, I mean, first of all, I argue in my book on cinema that her film, this film is the link between the first three books and the second book. But also, going back to your question, is that from the period of Ibrahim Golestan and Firoozeh Kashani-Sabet, a master prose stylist and amass a poet give birth to Iranian cinema. Now, then Iranian cinema goes its own way, because at this stage of Golistan and Farrokhzad, it's very much rooted in Persian literature and Persian literary and poetry. By the time that you get to someone like Amir Naderi, then visuality has become a reality unto itself. I mean, as it happens, Amir Naderi is entirely illiterate. I mean, he didn't even finish high school. But his eyes are fantastic. So to complete the point, these are various gestations of humanism. That is, by the time that you look at Amir Naderi's The Runner, for example, that is the absolute epic of both visuality and humanism in the context of this narrative that we come to the 20th century.